don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because today's story will leave you absolutely speechless, and I guarantee you've never heard anything quite like this before. So make sure to stick around until the very end, because the twist will blow your mind, and please share your thoughts in the comments below about what you would have done in this situation, because I'm genuinely curious about your perspective. And don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you think justice was served. The morning of my son Michael's wedding started like any other day, except my hands were shaking as I adjusted my navy blue dress in the hotel mirror, and I kept telling myself that everything would be fine, even though something in my gut had been telling me otherwise for months now, ever since Michael announced his engagement to Rebecca. And the way she looked at me during family dinners made my skin crawl, like she was already planning my funeral or something worse. And I tried to push those thoughts away, because this was supposed to be the happiest day of my son's life. But little did I know that by the end of this day, I would make a decision that would shock everyone, including myself, and change the course of multiple lives forever. My name is Margaret, and I'm 57 years old, and I raised Michael as a single mother after his father walked out on us when he was just 3 years old. And let me tell you, it wasn't easy working 2 jobs to put food on the table and clothes on his back while making sure he had everything he needed to succeed in life. And I sacrificed my own dreams and relationships to make sure that boy had every opportunity in the world. And he grew up to be a successful architect with his own firm, and I was so proud of him until Rebecca came into the picture 6 months ago, like a hurricane destroying everything in her path. Rebecca was 25 years old to Michael's 32, and she had this way of batting her eyelashes and speaking in a soft voice that made men lose their minds completely. And from the moment Michael introduced her to me at a family barbecue, I could see right through her act, because I've been around long enough to recognize a manipulator when I see one. And the way she immediately started talking about expensive wedding venues and designer dresses before they were even officially engaged told me everything I needed to know about her true intentions. But Michael was completely smitten and wouldn't hear a word against his precious Rebecca. No matter how gently I tried to express my concerns. The wedding planning process had been a nightmare from start to finish, with Rebecca making increasingly outrageous demands and expecting me to foot the bill for everything, since Michael's business was just getting off the ground and he didn't have the liquid capital for her dream wedding. And every time I suggested something more modest or budget-friendly, she would get this look in her eyes like I was personally attacking her, and she would run to Michael crying about how his mother didn't want them to be happy. And of course he would come to me asking why I couldn't just support their love and be happy for them. And I found myself writing check after check for flowers that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and a dress that could have paid for a small car, and a venue that was so expensive I had to take out a second mortgage on my house just to cover the deposit. The total cost of this wedding had reached nearly $150,000, and I had paid for absolutely everything, from the 7-course dinner reception, to the open bar, to the string quartet, to the photographer who charged $5,000 just for the engagement photos. And Rebecca acted like it was her God-given right to have all of these luxuries without contributing a single penny herself, because according to her, the bride's family shouldn't have to pay for anything in modern weddings, even though traditionally it was supposed to be the opposite. And every time I brought up money, she would just wave her hand dismissively and say that Michael's mother should want to give them the wedding of their dreams. And I was starting to feel like an ATM machine rather than a future mother-in-law. But what really broke my heart was watching my son change over these months. As Rebecca's influence grew stronger and he started treating me differently. Like I was an obligation, rather than the woman who had given up everything to raise him, and he stopped calling me just to check in. And when I would try to have conversations with him about anything other than wedding planning, his responses became shorter and more distant, and I could see Rebecca whispering in his ear during family gatherings, and the way his expression would shift told me exactly what kinds of things she was saying about me behind my back, and I felt like I was losing my son to this woman who saw dollar signs instead of love when she looked at him. The rehearsal dinner the night before the wedding should have been a warning sign, because Rebecca barely acknowledged my presence, even though I was the one paying for the entire event at the country club, and she spent the evening acting like the queen of the world while making passive-aggressive comments about how some mothers just need to learn when to step back and let their sons live their own lives. And I bit my tongue so hard, I tasted blood because I didn't want to cause a scene. But inside, I was seething at the audacity of this woman who was bleeding me dry financially, while simultaneously trying to cut me out of my son's life emotionally. And I went back to my hotel room that night with a heavy heart, wondering if I was making a huge mistake by enabling this farce of a marriage. The morning of the wedding, I woke up with an awful feeling in my stomach, but I pushed through it because I kept telling myself that maybe I was wrong about Rebecca, and maybe she would mature once she was married, and maybe my relationship with Michael would improve once the stress of wedding planning was over. And I got dressed in the expensive mother of the groom dress that Rebecca had specifically chosen for me, because she said she wanted to make sure I looked appropriate for the photographs. And even though the color washed me out completely, I wore it without complaint because I wanted this day to be perfect for my son, even if it was killing me inside. I arrived at the venue 3 hours before the ceremony was supposed to start because Rebecca had insisted that I needed to be there early to help with last-minute details, even though she had hired a wedding coordinator who was being paid a fortune to handle exactly those kinds of things. And when I walked into the bridal suite, expecting to see my future daughter-in-law putting on her makeup, I was greeted by a scene that made my blood run cold, because Rebecca was sitting there in her $5,000 wedding dress with a smug smile on her face, surrounded by her bridesmaids, who were all looking at me like I was something they had scraped off their shoes. And I immediately knew that something terrible was about to happen. Rebecca looked up at me with those fake, innocent eyes and said in the sweetest voice imaginable, "Margaret, I'm so glad you're here because we need to have a little chat about today. And I need you to understand that this is my wedding day and I want everything to be absolutely perfect. And that means I need you to do something very important for me." And I asked her what she needed, and she smiled even wider and said, "I need you to leave right now and not come back because your presence here is making me uncomfortable, and I don't want to be stressed out on my wedding day." And my mouth fell open because I couldn't believe what I was hearing from this woman, whose entire wedding I had financed down to the last dinner roll. I asked her if this was some kind of joke, because surely she couldn't be serious about asking me to leave my own son's wedding, especially after I had paid for everything. And she laughed this cold, calculating laugh and said, "Oh, Margaret, you're so dramatic. This isn't about money. This is about me wanting to start my marriage off on the right foot, and that means not having negative energy around me today. And you've made it very clear that you disapprove of me. So I think it's best if you just go home, and maybe Michael will call you next week when we get back from our honeymoon." And her bridesmaids were all nodding along like this was the most reasonable request in the world. And I felt like I was living in some kind of nightmare, where up was down and black was white. I told Rebecca that she was out of her mind if she thought I was going to miss my only son's wedding. especially after everything I had sacrificed to make this day possible. And she rolled her eyes and said, "Margaret, you're being selfish again. This is about what's best for Michael and me. And quite frankly, you've been nothing but a source of stress and drama throughout this entire engagement. And we just want to start our marriage without all of your negativity dragging us down. And I've already talked to Michael about this, and he agrees that it would be better if you weren't here today." And those words hit me like a physical blow, because I couldn't believe that my own son would agree to exclude me from his wedding. I demanded to speak to Michael immediately, and Rebecca just shrugged and said, "He's getting ready with his groomsmen," and specifically asked not to be disturbed because he's already stressed enough about today without having to deal with family drama. And I realized in that moment that she had orchestrated this entire situation to happen when Michael wasn't around, so that she could manipulate the narrative and make it seem like I was the one causing problems, when in reality, she was the one trying to destroy my relationship with my son. And I felt a rage building inside me that was unlike anything I had ever experienced in my entire life. I looked around the room at all of these young women who were benefiting from my generosity, while simultaneously treating me like garbage. And I made a decision that would change everything, and I pulled out my phone and started making calls right there in front of all of them, while Rebecca's face went from smug confidence to growing alarm as she realized that something was happening that she hadn't planned for. And the first call I made was to my bank, and I told them to put a stop payment on every single check I had written for this wedding that hadn't already cleared. And the customer service representative told me that they could stop the payments, but it would take a few minutes to process. And I said that was fine because I had plenty of time. The next call I made was to the wedding venue coordinator, and I explained that there had been a family emergency and the wedding needed to be cancelled immediately. And when she started protesting about cancellation fees, I told her to check her payment system because the check I had written for the final payment was being stopped as we spoke, and she put me on hold and came back a few minutes later with a much more cooperative attitude and agreed to cancel the venue rental effective immediately. And Rebecca was now standing up and screaming at me, asking what I thought I was doing. But I ignored her completely and continued making my calls. I called the caterer next and told them not to deliver the food because the wedding was cancelled. And when they started talking about contracts and penalties, I reminded them that they hadn't been paid in full yet, and if they wanted to pursue legal action, they were welcome to try. But they would be fighting an uphill battle since the event was no longer taking place. And after a brief hold, they agreed to cancel the catering service, and I could hear Rebecca crying in the background while her bridesmaids were frantically trying to call their own family members to figure out what was happening. But I was just getting started with my revenge. The florist was surprisingly understanding when I explained that the wedding was off, and they immediately agreed to stop the delivery since they hadn't left their shop yet, and the photographer was a little more difficult to deal with, but eventually agreed to cancel when I pointed out that there would be no wedding to photograph, and the band leader was actually relieved because he said he had never liked the playlist Rebecca had insisted on and thought it would be a terrible reception anyway. And one by one, every vendor that I had paid deposits to was agreeing to cancel their services, and Rebecca was becoming more hysterical with each phone call I made. By the time I finished making my calls, the bridal suite looked like a war zone, with Rebecca sobbing uncontrollably, while her bridesmaids tried to console her and figure out if there was any way to salvage the situation. But the damage was already done because you can't put together a wedding reception for 200 people in a matter of hours when all of your vendors have been cancelled and your venue has been taken away. And I felt a satisfaction that was both terrible and wonderful. As I watched this woman who had treated me with such contempt finally realize that her actions had consequences, Rebecca looked up at me with mascara running down her face and screamed that I was a vindictive old witch who was destroying her son's happiness out of pure spite. And I looked her straight in the eye and said, "No, Rebecca, I'm a mother who worked 2 jobs for 20 years to give her son every opportunity in life, and I'm not going to stand by and watch some gold digger manipulate him into cutting me out of his life while simultaneously expecting me to pay for her fairy tale wedding. And if you think you can treat me like an ATM machine while disrespecting me at every turn, then you have seriously underestimated who you're dealing with." I walked out of that bridal suite with my head held high, even though I knew that the next few hours were going to be incredibly difficult, because I still had to face my son and explain what I had done and why I had done it. But I felt lighter than I had in months, because finally I had taken control of a situation that had been spiraling out of hand for far too long. And as I walked through the venue, I could see wedding guests starting to arrive and looking confused as staff members informed them that the event had been cancelled. And I knew that word was going to spread quickly about what had happened. I found Michael in the groom's preparation room, adjusting his tie with a nervous smile on his face. And when he saw me, his expression immediately changed to concern. And he asked if everything was okay, because one of the groomsmen had gotten a call from his girlfriend, who was one of Rebecca's bridesmaids, saying that something was wrong. And I took a deep breath and told him that we needed to have a very serious conversation about his fiancée and what had just happened upstairs. And I watched his face go through a series of emotions as I explained exactly what Rebecca had said to me and what I had done in response. At first, Michael didn't believe me and insisted that there must have been some kind of misunderstanding, because Rebecca would never ask me to leave his wedding. But as the details sank in, and he started receiving frantic phone calls from various vendors and guests who had heard about the cancellation, his expression shifted from disbelief to anger, and then to something that looked like dawning realization. And I could see him starting to piece together other incidents over the past few months where Rebecca had made subtle comments about me that he had dismissed as pre-wedding stress, but now seemed to fit into a larger pattern of manipulation. Michael sat down heavily in one of the chairs and put his head in his hands and said, "Mom, I don't know what to say, because part of me is furious that you cancelled my wedding without talking to me first. But another part of me is starting to remember things that Rebecca said and did over the past few months that I ignored because I was so in love, and I don't know how to process all of this." And I sat down next to him and put my hand on his shoulder and told him that sometimes love makes us blind to things we don't want to see, and that I had tried to express my concerns gently over the months, but he hadn't been ready to hear them. I explained to Michael that I had never wanted to interfere with his happiness, and that all I had ever wanted was for him to find someone who loved him for who he was, rather than what he could provide, and that watching Rebecca manipulate him while treating me with such disrespect had broken my heart, because I could see him changing into someone I barely recognized. And I told him that cancelling the wedding was the most difficult decision I had ever made, but I couldn't stand by and watch him marry someone who was already trying to isolate him from the people who truly loved him. Michael looked up at me with tears in his eyes and said, "Mum, I think I've been an idiot, because now that I really think about it, Rebecca has been making comments about you for months and encouraging me to spend less time with you. And I thought she was just trying to establish our independence as a couple, but maybe there was more to it than that. And I'm starting to remember conversations where she talked about how much money you had and whether you had updated your will recently. And I feel sick, thinking that I might have been so blinded by her beauty that I missed all the red flags. Just then, the door burst open and Rebecca stormed in, wearing her wedding dress with her makeup smeared and her hair disheveled, and she started screaming at both of us about how we had ruined her perfect day and how she was going to sue me for breach of contract and emotional distress, and how Michael was a pathetic mama's boy who would never amount to anything without her guidance. And as she ranted and raved, I could see Michael's expression hardening because he was finally seeing the real Rebecca without the mask she had been wearing for months. Rebecca demanded that Michael choose between her and me right then and there, and said that if he didn't immediately call all the vendors and try to reinstate the wedding, then she would walk out of his life forever and never speak to him again. And I held my breath, waiting to see what my son would do, because this was the moment of truth, where he would have to decide whether he was going to continue enabling her manipulative behavior, or finally stand up for himself and for our relationship. Michael stood up slowly and looked at Rebecca for a long moment and then said, "Rebecca, I think my mother did us both a favor today because she helped me see what kind of person you really are. And I can't believe I was about to marry someone who would ask my mother to leave my wedding, especially after she paid for everything, and who would try to manipulate me into choosing between you and the woman who raised me and sacrificed everything for me. And I think we need to call off this engagement permanently because I don't want to spend my life with someone who treats the people I love with such cruelty." Rebecca's face went through a series of expressions, from shock to rage to panic, as she realized that her manipulation had backfired spectacularly, and she tried to backtrack and claim that she had just been stressed about the wedding and didn't mean what she said. But Michael wasn't buying it anymore, and he told her to pack her things and get out of his life because he finally understood that she had never loved him for who he was, but only for what he could provide, and that their entire relationship had been built on a foundation of lies and manipulation. The aftermath of that cancelled wedding was both difficult and liberating, because while I felt terrible about the financial loss and the embarrassment it caused, I also felt like I had saved my son from making the biggest mistake of his life. And over the following weeks, as Michael processed what had happened, he began to open up about other incidents where Rebecca had shown her true colors, but he had convinced himself to ignore them because he was so desperate to have someone love him that he was willing to overlook serious character flaws. Michael apologized to me repeatedly over the next few months for allowing Rebecca to come between us and for not seeing through her manipulations sooner. And he admitted that he had been so lonely after his last relationship ended that he had jumped into things with Rebecca too quickly, without really getting to know who she was beneath the surface. And we spent many long conversations rebuilding our relationship and healing the damage that had been done during those months when she was poisoning him against me. The financial cost of cancelling that wedding was significant, and I lost almost $30,000 in non-refundable deposits and cancellation fees. But I considered it money well spent because it saved my son from a lifetime of misery with a woman who would have continued to manipulate and control him while isolating him from his family and friends. And when I think about what their marriage would have been like, I know that I made the right choice, even though it was incredibly painful. At the time, Rebecca tried to cause trouble for us in the weeks following the cancelled wedding by spreading lies about what had happened and trying to turn mutual friends against us. But the truth has a way of coming out, and most people who knew us well could see right through her victim act and realize that she had brought the situation on herself through her own selfish and manipulative behavior. and eventually she gave up her campaign of revenge and disappeared from our lives completely. Michael eventually met someone new about a year later, and this time, I could immediately see the difference in how she treated both him and me. And Sarah was everything that Rebecca wasn't: genuine and kind and respectful and interested in building relationships rather than tearing them down. And when Michael proposed to Sarah 2 years later, I was genuinely happy for them because I could see that this was real love based on mutual respect and shared values, rather than manipulation and greed. Sarah and Michael's wedding was a small, intimate affair with just close family and friends, and it cost less than $5,000. But it was filled with more genuine joy and love than Rebecca's cancelled extravaganza ever could have been. And as I watched my son exchange vows with a woman who truly loved him, I knew that everything had worked out exactly as it was supposed to, and that sometimes the most difficult decisions we make turn out to be the most important ones. The experience taught me that as parents, we sometimes have to make hard choices to protect our children, even when they don't understand or appreciate it at the time, and that standing up for yourself doesn't make you selfish, it makes you strong, and that no amount of money is worth sacrificing your dignity or your relationship with the people you love most in the world. And I would make the same choice again in a heartbeat, because protecting my son from a lifetime of misery was worth every penny I lost and every moment of pain I endured. Looking back now, 3 years later, I can see that cancelling that wedding was one of the best decisions I ever made, because it not only saved Michael from a terrible marriage, but it also strengthened our relationship and showed him that I would always fight for him, even when it was difficult, and that sometimes love means making hard choices that others might not understand. And I'm proud that I had the courage to stand up to Rebecca and refuse to let her treat me like a doormat while she destroyed my family. The story spread through our community like wildfire, and I became something of a local legend among the other mothers who had similar experiences with manipulative daughters-in-law, and many of them told me that they wished they had the courage to do what I did when they were in similar situations, and that seeing me stand up for myself inspired them to set better boundaries in their own relationships. And I realized that my actions had ripple effects far beyond just my own family. Michael and Sarah now have 2 beautiful children, and our relationship is stronger than it has ever been. And Sarah often tells me how grateful she is that I saved Michael from Rebecca, because she can't imagine what kind of person he would have become if he had stayed in that toxic relationship. And when I look at my happy, healthy family, I know that every sacrifice was worth it, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's destructive behavior, even when it's painful. I want everyone watching this video to remember that you don't have to tolerate disrespect from anyone, regardless of what they might be contributing to your life, and that sometimes saying no and standing up for yourself is the most powerful thing you can do, and that real love is never about manipulation or control, but about mutual respect and genuine care for each other's well-being. And if someone is trying to isolate you from your family or friends, that's a major red flag that should not be ignored. So what do you think about what I did? Was I right to cancel the wedding? Or should I have handled the situation differently? Let me know in the comments below, because I'm really interested to hear your thoughts. And if you've been in a similar situation, I'd love to hear your story too. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss any of my videos. And please share this video with anyone who might benefit from hearing this story, because sometimes we all need reminding that it's okay to stand up for ourselves and that we don't have to accept poor treatment from anyone, no matter who they are.